Let me start with a blunt truth. Great powers often underestimate the allies they take for granted. When Washington signals that it doesn't need Canada, it isn't projecting strength, it's revealing strategic blindness. In international politics, arrogance is often the prelude to self inflicted damage. Strategic arrogance weakens great powers because it distorts how leaders perceive both their own capabilities and the environment in which they operate. And history shows repeatedly that when states begin to believe their power is unlimited, they make decisions that generate resistance rather than compliance. From a realist standpoint, power is never absolute, it is always relational, meaning it depends on how others respond, adjust, and counterbalance. When a great power dismisses the importance of allies or assumes that dependence runs only one way, it signals not confidence but miscalculation. Arrogance encourages policymakers to confuse dominance with invulnerability, leading them to overlook constraints imposed by geography, economics, and interdependence. In the modern international system, even the most powerful states rely on stable regional networks to sustain their influence. And when those networks are weakened by careless rhetoric or coercive policy, the costs accumulate quietly but decisively. Strategic arrogance also erodes credibility because allies and rivals alike begin to doubt the reliability of commitments made by a power that appears dismissive of partnership. Once that doubt takes root, cooperation becomes transactional, hedging behavior increases, and the system moves toward fragmentation rather than alignment. For a great power, this is dangerous terrain because managing alliances is not charity, it is a central mechanism for preserving dominance at lower cost. When arrogance replaces prudence, leaders often assume that economic pressure or political leverage can substitute for trust. But markets and institutions respond to uncertainty with volatility, not obedience. The result is often self inflicted economic strain that weakens domestic support for foreign policy ambitions. Strategic arrogance also encourages overextension, as leaders believe they can absorb the consequences of aggressive posturing without meaningful backlash. Yet realism teaches that power decays when it is stretched beyond sustainable limits. The international system is unforgiving toward states that ignore feedback, and arrogance functions as a filter that blocks warning signs until they become crises. Moreover, when a great power publicly signals that certain partners are expendable, it invites those partners to diversify their options, deepen alternative relationships, and reduce reliance on the dominant state. This behavior may be rational for smaller states, but it accelerates the relative decline of the arrogant power by shrinking its sphere of influence. Over time, what begins as rhetorical bravado translates into structural weakness because influence is not maintained by force alone, but by predictable cooperation. Strategic arrogance also narrows the range of policy choices available in moments of crisis because bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt quickly. In high stakes environments, flexibility is power, and arrogance destroys flexibility by locking leaders into maximalist positions that are difficult to reverse without loss of face. From a realist lens, the most successful great powers are not those that constantly assert their dominance, but those that manage perceptions carefully, balance coercion with reassurance, and understand that restraint is often a sign of strength. When arrogance dominates strategy, it creates blind spots that adversaries exploit and allies resent, ultimately shifting the balance of power in subtle but lasting ways. The tragedy is that these outcomes are rarely immediate, which allows decision makers to dismiss early consequences as noise rather than signal until the cumulative effect becomes impossible to ignore. In that sense, strategic arrogance is not just a political flaw, it is a systemic liability that undermines long term power by corroding the very relationships and structures that sustain it. Canada's role in U.S. economic stability is structural because the relationship between the two countries extends far beyond simple trade agreements or diplomatic niceties, reflecting decades of integration across energy, manufacturing, logistics, finance, and technology that together form a critical backbone for the North American economy. The United States and Canada are each other's largest trading partners in goods and services, and this interdependence is not easily replicated or replaced by other global actors. Canadian energy resources, particularly oil, natural gas, and uranium, are integral to American energy security, providing a stable and geographically proximate supply that reduces vulnerability to disruptions in more distant and politically volatile regions. Beyond energy, Canada's role in supply chains is crucial, as components for automobiles, electronics, aerospace, and critical infrastructure flow seamlessly across the border, making disruptions costly and complex. The structural nature of this economic link means that sudden policy decisions that threaten or diminish cooperation have immediate ripple effects, triggering increased costs, delays, and uncertainty throughout the U.S. economy. Canadian investment in the United States also reinforces this integration, with Canadian firms owning significant portions of manufacturing, banking, and service industries, ensuring that capital flows, innovation, and employment are mutually dependent. At the same time, Canada relies on the US as a primary market for its exports, meaning the economic relationship is reciprocal, and attempts by the US to marginalize Canada create vulnerabilities that extend to domestic industries and consumers. Realist theory emphasizes that interdependence does not eliminate power dynamics, but rather structures them. And in the case of the US Canada relationship, the economic framework gives both states leverage and creates incentives for cooperation. But any neglect or underestimation of these structures can weaken the dominant power as much as the ostensibly weaker one. The historical context reinforces this perspective, as periods of tension, such as disputes over trade tariffs or cross-border regulations, have produced measurable disruptions in growth, employment, and inflation, illustrating that Canada is not merely a convenient partner, but a structural element of North American economic stability. Beyond trade and investment, regulatory alignment, infrastructure coordination, and joint technological initiatives amplify the structural role, as the two economies are deeply embedded in a system of standards and networks that facilitate the efficient movement of goods, services, and capital. For instance, the energy grid, transportation corridors, and cross-border logistics hubs are optimized for cooperation, meaning that abrupt changes in policy or rhetoric can cascade through multiple sectors, affecting production timelines, pricing, and consumer confidence. Financial systems are also intertwined, with Canadian banks holding significant U.S. assets and vice versa, creating channels of liquidity and credit that stabilize markets and reduce systemic risk. Disregarding or undervaluing these structural connections underestimates the degree to which economic stability in the United States depends on predictable and reliable cooperation with Canada. From a strategic perspective, structural interdependence provides a buffer against external shocks, whether geopolitical, environmental, or market-driven, but that buffer can be weakened if political leadership assumes that geographic proximity and historical friendship guarantee automatic compliance or acquiescence. The consequences of neglecting Canada's structural role are not hypothetical. They manifest as immediate trade imbalances, disrupted supply chains, energy price volatility, and decreased investor confidence. Moreover, structural interdependence extends into innovation and research as Canadian universities, tech hubs, and industrial research programs collaborate closely with U.S. counterparts, generating intellectual property, technological advancement, and workforce development that underpin competitiveness in global markets. Disrupting this ecosystem is not merely symbolic. It creates gaps that competitors can exploit, reducing long-term strategic advantage. Political rhetoric that minimizes the importance of Canada can inadvertently signal unreliability to markets, which respond to expectations as much as to tangible events, further amplifying economic instability. Ultimately, the US Canada economic relationship illustrates that great power stability is not solely a function of military might or global reach, but also of managing and sustaining regional economic structures that provide resilience, predictability, and opportunity. Canada's structural role in US economic stability demonstrates that strategic miscalculations regarding allies are costly, not just diplomatically, but materially, and that maintaining prosperity and security requires acknowledgement of these interdependencies, careful policy management, and respect for the systems that connect two nations in ways that extend far beyond borders and rhetoric. Supply chains amplify political miscalculations because in today's globalized and interconnected economy, the movement of goods, materials, and components is rarely linear, rarely isolated, and rarely forgiving of abrupt disruptions caused by policy errors, diplomatic missteps, or misjudged statements of power. Modern supply chains are complex networks that stretch across borders, rely on precise timing, and depend on multiple layers of interdependent actors, from raw material suppliers to manufacturers, logistics providers, distributors, and retailers. Any miscalculation in foreign policy, such as underestimating a partner state's economic leverage or dismissing the importance of cross-border cooperation, can propagate through these networks with effects that are immediate, costly, and difficult to reverse. The case of the United States and Canada exemplifies this reality because the two nations are deeply integrated economically, with supply chains spanning energy, automotive production, technology, agriculture, and aerospace, among other sectors. Canadian resources, including oil, natural gas, timber, and minerals, flow into U.S. manufacturing and energy infrastructure, while components manufactured in Canada support American industries that rely on timely and predictable inputs to maintain production schedules. When political rhetoric or policy signals indicate a disregard for Canada's role, it creates uncertainty in these supply chains, leading firms to adjust inventories, seek alternative suppliers, and hedge against potential disruptions. These adjustments, though rational for individual companies, introduce inefficiencies that increase costs, reduce output, and undermine competitiveness, creating a feedback loop in which political miscalculations translate into economic consequences. Supply chains also magnify risk because they are highly sensitive to perception and expectation. Markets and firms respond not only to actual disruptions, but also to the anticipation of instability. When the United States declares it doesn't need a key partner like Canada, the signal is interpreted by investors, managers, and trading partners as a warning that reliability may be compromised. Firms then adjust their strategies preemptively, diverting resources, changing sourcing patterns, or delaying investment, which produces real economic effects even before any tangible disruption occurs. Furthermore, supply chains are tightly coupled with regulatory frameworks, cross-border standards, and logistical infrastructure. Changes in policy or antagonistic behavior toward an integrated partner can trigger regulatory bottlenecks, delays at customs, or misalignment in technical standards, all of which ripple through production schedules and international commerce. For industries like automotive manufacturing, aerospace, or high-tech electronics, even minor interruptions in component availability can halt production lines, delay deliveries, and generate cascading financial losses. Political miscalculations are amplified precisely because supply chains are optimized for efficiency rather than redundancy, meaning that the very efficiency that creates competitive advantage also creates vulnerability to errors in judgment at the governmental level. Additionally, supply chains embody long-term commitments and investments that cannot be easily reversed. Factories, transportation hubs, cross-border pipelines, and distribution centers are designed with expectations of continuity, and sudden political shifts that disrupt these assumptions force costly adjustments, renegotiations, and in some cases, complete restructuring. These structural rigidities magnify the consequences of political miscalculations, turning what might seem like minor diplomatic slights into significant economic setbacks. The problem is compounded by the networked nature of modern supply chains, in which a single disruption in one country can cascade across multiple industries and sectors. For example, if Canadian energy exports are reduced or delayed due to deteriorating relations with the United States, this not only affects energy dependent industries, but also influences transportation, manufacturing, and service sectors that rely on consistent energy pricing and availability. Similarly, the flow of auto parts from Canada to US assembly plants affects not only production, but also employment, taxation, and regional economic stability. Supply chains also interact with financial systems because trade financing, credit arrangements, and investment decisions are all predicated on predictable flows of goods and materials. Political miscalculations that undermine trust or reliability in these flows generate uncertainty in financial markets, increasing the cost of capital and reducing confidence in economic projections. Moreover, supply chains are dynamic and adaptive, meaning that disruptions prompt competitors, both domestic and foreign, to exploit vulnerabilities, capture market share, or reposition strategically. When a great power like the United States makes errors in its treatment of a partner like Canada, it not only suffers direct economic consequences, but also risks losing influence and strategic advantage to actors who step into the vacuum created by mismanagement. The amplification effect of supply chains extends to national security as well, because many industrial and technological systems vital to defense rely on integrated supply networks. Disruptions caused by political miscalculations can reduce readiness, delay critical production, and force reliance on alternative sources that may be more expensive or less secure. From a broader perspective, the lesson is that in a globalized economy, no state operates in isolation, and even the most powerful actors are constrained by the interdependent systems they inhabit. Political arrogance or misjudgment is not contained within diplomatic circles. It propagates through economic and industrial networks, producing consequences that are magnified by the complexity, interconnectedness, and rigidity of modern supply chains. Supply chains do not merely reflect economic relationships, they encode power, trust, and strategic stability, meaning that errors in judgment, miscommunication, or disrespect toward integrated partners can have amplified effects that weaken a state's position both economically and geopolitically. In short, the intricacy and interdependence of supply chains act as a multiplier for political miscalculations, turning statements, policies, or missteps that might seem isolated into systemic challenges that affect production, markets, innovation, and long-term strategic advantage. Great powers that ignore this reality risk allowing the very networks that support their dominance to become vectors for economic and political vulnerability, demonstrating that in the modern world, misjudging the role of partners and the fragility of supply chains is a mistake that can reverberate far beyond its initial point of origin.